The guard stood frozen at the cell door, staring at the scene in disbelief. Mike Tyson was lying calmly on his bunk, hands behind his head, looking as relaxed as someone who'd just woken from a peaceful sleep. On the floor of his cell, 3 inmates lay motionless, barely conscious, their faces showing the unmistakable signs of a very one-sided encounter. 6 hours earlier, those same 3 inmates had made the biggest mistake of their prison careers. They'd tried to rob Mike Tyson while he slept. Now, to understand how a routine night in a maximum security prison turned into a morning where guards found 3 beaten inmates in Mike Tyson's cell, while Mike himself looked like he'd done nothing more strenuous than sleep, we need to go back to the beginning of that night. But before we get to that moment, if you're enjoying these Mike Tyson stories, we post new videos every single day, so hit that subscribe button and don't miss out. It was sometime in late 1992 or early 1993, during Mike Tyson's sentence at the Indiana Youth Center. Mike had been there for several months by this point, long enough to establish a routine, long enough that most inmates knew who he was and gave him the space and respect that came with being Mike Tyson. But prisons are dynamic environments. New inmates arrive regularly, and not all of them get the message about which people you leave alone. 3 such inmates had arrived at the facility about 2 weeks earlier. Their names were Marcus, Tommy, and a man everyone called Snake. Though for this story, their identities matter less than their terrible judgment. They were all in their mid-20s, all doing time for various theft and assault charges, all with the kind of false confidence that comes from never having faced real consequences. They'd heard about Mike Tyson being in the facility, of course. Everyone had. But they'd also heard rumors that Mike kept to himself, that he was trying to do his time quietly, that he didn't want trouble. To these 3, that translated as, he's soft now, he's vulnerable. They'd been watching Mike's routines for days. They noticed he had a single cell, a privilege that came with his celebrity status, and the facility's desire to avoid the complications that would come from giving Mike Tyson a cellmate. They noticed he went to commissary regularly, which meant he probably had money or valuable items stored in his cell. And most importantly, they noticed that late at night, during the 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. shift when guard presence was minimal, the cell block was quiet and largely unmonitored. On this particular night, they made their move. Around 2:30 a.m., when most of the cell block was deep in sleep and the night guard was doing rounds in another section, the 3 inmates quietly made their way to Mike's cell. Prison cells don't lock from the inside in most facilities. They're controlled externally by guards, so entering wasn't difficult. The cell was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with a bunk bed bolted to the wall, a small metal desk and chair, a toilet and sink combination, and a narrow locker where inmates kept their personal items. The only light came from the dim emergency lighting in the corridor, casting long shadows. Mike was on the top bunk, seemingly asleep, breathing steady and deep. Marcus entered first, followed by Tommy and Snake. They moved carefully, quietly, their prison-issued shoes making soft sounds on the concrete floor. Marcus held a shiv, a crude knife made from a sharpened piece of metal, not necessarily to use, but to have if things went wrong. Tommy moved toward Mike's locker, slowly opening it, trying not to make noise. Inside were some commissary items, candy bars, instant coffee, a few other small luxuries that had value in prison economy. Not a fortune, but enough to make this worth their while. Snake kept watch, his eyes moving between Mike's sleeping form and the cell door, listening for guards. Tommy was pulling items from the locker, stuffing them into his pockets, when Mike's breathing pattern changed. It was subtle, just a slight shift in rhythm, but Snake noticed it. "Yo," he whispered urgently, "I think he's—" Mike's eyes opened. For a moment, nobody moved. Mike looked down from his bunk at the 3 intruders in his cell, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Then, in one fluid motion, He swung his legs over the side of the bunk and dropped to the floor. The cell suddenly felt much smaller. Marcus raised the shiv, trying to look threatening. "Stay back, Tyson. We don't want trouble. Just let us take what we came for in." Mike didn't let him finish. What happened next took maybe 90 seconds, though to the three inmates it probably felt much longer. Mike moved with the precision of someone who'd spent his entire life learning how to hurt people efficiently. No wasted motion, no excessive force, just the exact amount of violence necessary to end the threat quickly. The details aren't important. This isn't about glorifying violence. What matters is that three men who'd entered that cell thinking they had the advantage learned very quickly how wrong they were. Mike had fought professionally against the best boxers in the world. These were untrained criminals in a confined space. By the time it was over, all three inmates were on the floor, conscious but thoroughly defeated, nursing injuries that would heal but would remind them of this moment for a very long time. Mike stood over them for a moment, breathing slightly heavier but otherwise composed. Then, without a word, he climbed back onto his bunk, lay down, put his hands behind his head, and closed his eyes as if nothing had happened. The three inmates lay there in the darkness, too hurt and too shocked to move, processing what had just occurred. At 6 a.m., when the morning guard shift began their cell checks, a young officer named Rodriguez reached Mike's cell and looked inside for the routine count and welfare check. He stopped mid-stride, his eyes widening. "What the?" He grabbed his radio. "Sergeant, I need you at cell 147, now." Within minutes, several guards and a sergeant had arrived. They stood at the cell door, taking in the scene. Mike Tyson lying peacefully on his bunk, looking as calm as someone waking from a pleasant dream, and three inmates on the floor in various states of distress. "Mr. Tyson," the sergeant said carefully, "what happened here?" Mike opened his eyes slowly as if he'd been genuinely asleep. "Morning, Sergeant. These three broke into my cell around 2:30, maybe 3 a.m., tried to rob me. I defended myself." The sergeant looked at the three inmates, then back at Mike. "All three of them." "All three of them," Mike confirmed, his voice completely calm. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine. They're the ones who'll need the nurse." The guards began the process of removing the three inmates from the cell. As they helped Marcus to his feet, he avoided looking at Mike, his face showing pain and humiliation. Tommy had to be supported by two guards as he walked. Snake refused help but moved slowly, clearly hurting. As they were being escorted out of the cell, other inmates in the block had woken up and were watching through their cell bars. The news was spreading quickly. Three guys had tried to rob Mike Tyson in his sleep, and Mike had handled all three of them alone. "Did you see them?" One inmate whispered to another. "Man can barely walk." "Three of them against Tyson," another murmured. "What the hell were they thinking?" The sergeant stayed behind after the three inmates were removed. "Mr. Tyson, I'll need a formal statement, but from what I'm seeing, this was clearly self-defense. You have a right to protect yourself and your property." "I know my rights, Sergeant." "Still, I have to ask, three men in a small cell in the dark, and you don't have a mark on you." Mike sat up on his bunk, finally meeting the sergeant's eyes. "I spent my whole life learning how to fight, Sergeant. Those three learned something tonight too. Hopefully they remember it." Before we continue, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Was Mike right to defend himself, or should he have called for guards? Now back to the story. By breakfast time, the entire prison knew what had happened. The story spread through the facility like wildfire, growing slightly with each retelling, though the basic facts remained consistent. Three inmates had broken into Mike Tyson's cell to rob him, and Mike had dealt with all three of them single-handedly in the darkness. The three would-be robbers spent the day in the infirmary, being treated and giving their statements to investigators. Their stories corroborated Mike's account perfectly. They'd entered his cell with criminal intent. He defended himself. End of story. The shiv that Marcus had been carrying was recovered from the cell floor, which only strengthened Mike's self-defense claim. No charges were filed against Mike. The facility's investigation concluded that he'd acted appropriately given the circumstances. 3 intruders in his cell, at least one armed, in the middle of the night. Prison rules, like laws on the outside, recognize the right to self-defense. But beyond the legal conclusions, something else happened in the wake of that night. The respect Mike had already commanded in the facility multiplied tenfold. It was one thing to know intellectually that Mike Tyson was a professional fighter, one of the most feared boxers in history. It was another thing entirely to see evidence of what that meant in practice. 3 men in the dark, armed, and Mike had handled it like it was nothing. An older inmate named Jerome, who'd been in the system for years and had seen his share of violence, later told anyone who'd listen, "I've seen a lot of fights in prison, seen some tough guys, but what Tyson did, man, that was different. That wasn't a fight. That was a lesson being taught, and the whole facility learned it." The 3 inmates who'd attempted the robbery were eventually transferred to different facilities. Prison officials decided it was safer for everyone, including them, if they weren't in the same institution as Mike. Before they left, word was that all 3 had requested the transfer themselves, not wanting to spend the rest of their sentences in a place where they'd be forever known as the guys who tried to rob Mike Tyson and failed spectacularly. Mike continued his sentence without further incident. His cell was never approached again by anyone with bad intentions. Other inmates gave him space, respect, and the kind of cautious deference you give to someone who's proven they can handle themselves even when outnumbered and surprised. Years later, Mike would reflect on that night with a mixture of regret and acceptance. "I didn't want that to happen," he'd say. "I wasn't trying to hurt anybody. I was just trying to do my time. But when 3 guys break into your cell in the middle of the night, when one of them has a weapon, you don't have a lot of options. You do what you have to do to survive." He'd pause, then add, "The thing about prison is respect is everything. It's the currency that matters more than anything else. That night, I didn't set out to earn respect, but that's what happened. And honestly, it made the rest of my time there easier. Nobody wanted to test me after that. Nobody wanted to be the next cautionary tale." They tried robbing Mike Tyson while he slept in his cell, 3 inmates against 1, armed and confident. By morning, guards found those 3 inmates on Mike's cell floor, thoroughly defeated, while Mike himself lay calmly on his bunk as if nothing had happened. But the real story wasn't about the violence. It was about consequences, about the gap between thinking you're tough and actually being tough, about respect earned not through intimidation but through capability. 3 men learned in 90 seconds what Mike Tyson had spent a lifetime mastering, and an entire prison learned that some people's reputations aren't exaggerated, they're earned, and they're deserved. Mike Tyson was in prison trying to do his time quietly, trying to avoid trouble. But when trouble found him in the darkness of his cell, he handled it with the same precision and skill that had made him a champion. And everyone who heard what happened that night understood. Mike Tyson wasn't just a celebrity inmate. He was exactly who he'd always been, one of the most dangerous men on the planet, even in his sleep.